The honourable member for Western Arctic.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank everyone here who is supporting my speech, because my speech speaks to a very difficult bill that this government has brought forward, Bill C-27, ostensibly called a Transparency Act, but really it's another colonial act. This is what this bill is about. We have a bill that really speaks to a very small segment of society that considers that First Nations have extreme problems with accountability, and it demands a system of accountability that is really unacceptable. It really doesn't meet the needs of First Nations and imposes a burden which will, in some cases, put them at a disadvantage with other Canadians. This bill forces First Nations who are still under the Indian Act to publicly post their financial statements. Any money is provided to chiefs and band councillors regardless of where it's earned, including reimbursements for out-of-pocket expenses. Its auditors' reports on financial statements and its auditors' reports on monies paid to chiefs and council. And it must make these available on a website for a period of 10 years. All this information is already accessible to band members through the Department of Aboriginal Affairs by request. So this information is available to those that want the information, and they make use of that service from what we were told, upwards of 150 to 200 times a year. I don't know if that's every year or particular years, but that's the kind of, out of the 600 or so bands, that's the volume of requests that are put forward. At committee, once we took this bill to committee, even those that supported the bill said that there needed to be amendments. Some of the major supporters within the First Nation, and there were a few, Mr. Speaker, that took the position of the government and said, yeah, we want that. They made that choice. But by and large, the majority of First Nations understood and recognized that this was not the way to do business. This was not government to government. You know, Mr. Speaker, I asked the minister when he was in front of us, how do you consider the relationship between the federal government and the band councils in Canada? He said, is it government to government? And he agreed with me. He said, yes, it is. Then, the hypocrisy of this bill, which treats First Nations as wards of the state. You know, in the Northwest Territories, another government that is set up by a bill of this Parliament, the NWT Act, the NWT government gets to choose how it discloses information, Mr. Speaker. So, and that applies to Nunavut as well as to the Yukon. So what we have here is a situation where the government agrees it's a government-to-government relationship, yet it won't treat the First Nations in the same fashion as it treats others. Now, we have equality in this country. We have equality as a guiding principle of this country, and this Conservative government seems to take it and ignore it. And I think there's a hypocrisy issue here as well, because quite clearly this government has been one of the most secretive governments in the history of Canada. International agencies that monitor access to information have taken us from 4th place in the world to 52nd place in our ability to access information from our government. In terms of the information that's given, Mr. Speaker, when this government came in, the average redaction of information was 15%. 15% of the items that government released to the public were redacted. It's now 47%. Why? Has the nature of government changed so much? Has secrecy become so important? Well, if it's so important for this government, why are they insisting that for these First Nations government that they have to show everything to everyone in this country on a website available for every nitpicker in the country to look at everyone with a grudge against First Nations to go there and go through their dirty laundry to look for something. That's what this government wants to do to First Nations. That's what they're doing with this bill. What a shame. They could have said to First Nations, through incentives, they enabled First Nations to develop their own information systems, and many have. Many of the First Nations that came in front of us said, look, here's our Constitution, here's the work that we've done. Here's how we disclose our information. We're proud of it. We did this ourselves. What's this government do? Slap it on everyone. How is that government to government? Shame on you. Shame on you for not treating First Nations in a respectful fashion. That is the problem we had in Canada for 100 years. I thought we were trying to get over this problem of treating First Nations with less than respect after signing treaties with them, after taking over their land. When are we going to treat them with respect? Well, let's talk about the Conservative government for a while, because really this bill is going to pass. We're going to end up in a situation where First Nations are going to have to wait 3 years to get this fixed. But right now, this government has done very, very bad things to accountability and transparency. One of the first acts of this government was to create the Office of the Parliamentary Budget Officer, saying it would make the government more accountable. Since that day, this government has denied information, delayed the release of information, and demeaned the PBO. Most recently, the PBO has had to threaten court action to get the information he needs to provide us parliamentarians, people in this House, with the facts we need to properly review Conservative budgets and other financial statements. And this is a public government, open to every citizen of the country, unlike First Nations, which are governments for specific groups of people in this country. So, yes, we have a responsibility as a public government to release information to all and sundry. So what do? Now we have, when it comes to the environment, the Conservative government has muzzled all the scientists, shut down investigation into climate change, taken out the experimental lakes area, it's closed Arctic research centers, it muzzles scientists from speaking in public. What is going on? What is it about science that Conservatives feel that the rest of Canadians shouldn't know? What is it about science that they want to hide from us? That's a question that perhaps we'll get at the next election. That's when we'll actually get the Canadian public to decide what information they want. The F-35 Auditor's Report, the handling of the Auditor General's report. In his first report as Auditor General, Michael Ferguson said the Department of National Defence gambled on the F-35 fighter jet without running a fair competition, while lacking cost certainty or any guarantee the plane could replace the current fleet of CF-18s by the end of the decade. Went on to talk about the uncoordinated fashion among federal departments. What did this government do? First, they said his information was all wrong after refusing to release the information he requested. Then they tried to shut committee meetings into this boondoggle. The final attempt by the Conservative government to hide the truth has been to delay the release of Public Accounts Committee report into the debacle. Hardly the actions of a government that supports accountability and transparency. 1 minute, Mr. Speaker. I could go on for quite a long time about the inadequacy of this government when it comes to accountability and transparency. And I think, the Canadian public would probably enjoy to hear all the issues that we have with that. I could talk about robocalls, the impact of the healthcare transfers cuts to the province, the cost of the ideological prison agenda, or election financing schemes. But I'd be here all day, and I only have 30 seconds. So, Mr. Speaker, for the Conservatives to demand that the single biggest issue for First Nations people, many of them who live in third world poverty, is the need for accountability beyond what they do already, is real hypocrisy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question come on time.
Questions and comments?
L'honorable député de
The honorable member for Louis Saint Laurent. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Colleague from Western Arctic for his wonderful speech. He knows the topic very well, and he has always been a really good advocate for the First Nation, and I'm really proud of him. And I want to ask him a question. I've seen the numbers. The different Aboriginal administration right now table more than 60,000 reports every day to the Ministry of Aboriginal Affairs. That's 165 reports every day that they have to give to the minister. And right now they've got no shame. They have the nerve to tell us that there's no accountability and there's not enough transparency when they're already drowning under bureaucracy and all this paperwork. So I just wanted him to comment on that and to see what his thoughts are on that subject.
the honourable member for Western Arctic.
Well, I think the issue surrounding the paperwork that First Nations are required to produce is really extraordinary. These are governments that are hobbled in their work by the federal government and by the Aboriginal Affairs bureaucracy. There's no doubt about that. That goes on every single issue that these people work on. So it requires massive change, but it doesn't. It's not a question of stupidly increasing the accountability provisions like what's happening with this bill. It's about coming to understandings of how governments can do their accountability in a good fashion. There's so much to do for First Nations. They have so much promise and potential, and they're being held back tremendously by what the rules are that run their lives.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Winnipeg North.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I think one of the things that's important for us to emphasize is the fact that there are many First Nation leaders that are actually advocating for more accountability and financial accountability and transparency. That is nothing that is new in terms of many of the Aboriginal or First Nations leaders. It's not like the government of Canada is saying that there has to be transparency, and the leadership amongst the First Nations is saying, no, we don't want transparency. That's not happening. And it was recognized in good part, or at least in the small part, I should say, when there was in the Kelowna Accord, where First Nations led to the arguments as to maybe we should be having a First Nations Auditor General, which would have provided accountability and so forth. So I wouldn't want people to get the impression that there's rejection, outright rejection in terms of the whole issue of financial accountability and transparency from with our First Nation leadership, because that's not the case. What is the case today is the opposition to why it is the government failed to consult and work with the Aboriginal, or First Nation, I should say, leadership of our communities in coming up with how best to deal with the issue of accountability and transparency. Would the member not agree?
The honourable member for Western Arctic.
Well, I agree to a certain extent. Yeah, consultation is important, but it's important to recognize the fundamental principle that this is government-to-government relationship. You know, the government of Canada doesn't consult with the government of the Northwest Territories and then tell them what their transparency arrangements are going to be. So what are we speaking about when we speak about government-to-government relationships? The First Nations that accomplish the work for themselves in developing their own systems of transparency are going to be the most successful ones. That's simply the case. We need to throw off the shackles that exist between the federal government and the First Nations in a proper and respectful fashion. And this bill simply doesn't, it goes in the wrong direction. It goes in another direction, which is simply going to increase the aspects of what we don't want. And so that is the problem we have here with this bill. And it's a problem that this government has to recognize, because it's got a number of other bills coming forward that are going to do the same thing, that are going to create the same problem about the relationship between the federal government and the First Nations.